Welcome, everyone. A pleasure to see each of you here for practice today, as always. And my name is Dhammadipa. I'm here to offer the Sunday Sound of Dhamma program. And as usual, we're going to go ahead and meditate for about 10 or 15 minutes with a little light guidance. And then I'll offer Dhamma talk. And there will be hopefully some time for questions or reflections at the end. And I just want to make one other announcement, which is that there will not be a talk on February 25th. So a week from today, that Sunday, I'm not able to give the Sunday Sound of Dhamma program. And then, but there will be, again, we'll be back on March 3rd. Okay, so just so that you know that one change. Always it's always a good idea also just to check the website once in a while, and there are updates too on the homepage and on the calendar. That's Dassanaya.org, just in case you didn't know. All right, wonderful. So you can go ahead and begin to settle in. I think today we're going to have a look at 3 of the sense bases. I like to begin with a bit of movement, just loosening up any tendency to lean toward the screen. And allowing the body to find a balanced, upright position. Releasing the belly. And really sensing the natural stability of the body. And turning the attention to the sensation of touch in one foot. Just aware of the sensations of touch that are coming, arriving in awareness. Staying curious about the sensations of touch in the foot. Now a shift in attention to rest the mind on the sensations of hearing. No need to strain at all. Just noticing the sensations of hearing that arrive and pass away. Perhaps it's easy to observe the changes from moment to moment in the sensations of hearing. And finally, turning the attention one more time to the mind as a sense realm. How is it to experience thoughts and perceptions as mere sensations of the mind? Aware of the thoughts and the sensations and perceptions that are happening as mind. As mere sensations arising and passing. Ding! I don't have my bell with me. I'm at my daughter's house this week. But that brings us to the end of our meditation. So, meditation on 3 of the 6 sense realms. And so the other 3 would be smelling and seeing and tasting. All right, so welcome, folks who have just arrived. Welcome. And I'll begin with the homage to the Buddha and the Triple Gem. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namasami. Excuse me. Sometimes people ask me, why meditate? Why meditate? Maybe you've asked that yourself sometimes. What's the deal? What's so interesting about meditation? What is so different about meditation as compared to any other way that we might live our lives, spend our time? Or to put it more specifically, how does sitting and paying attention help you to understand the world and your place in it, your experience of it? Because while meditation isn't the only practice by any stretch, I think actually that if we're going to persevere on the path, we need to really have a broad understanding of practice as including many things: walking and sitting and chanting and study and Dhamma talks and good friendship and many, many things. But certainly meditation is key, at least as it's been described by the teachers of the past. So in order to answer the question, or at least respond to the question, perhaps, I want to talk a little bit about the types of experience that you might have as you're meditating. And goodness knows there are, again, many different types of meditation. In fact, I think, y'all will excuse me. There are many, many different types of meditation. And one of the things that saddens me is to hear anybody say that there's only one way to meditate. You hear that quite often, actually, and that's quite disappointing, really. So there are many ways, but nonetheless, I want to just make some general observations about the types of experience that one might have when meditating. Not specifically what you will see, because I think it's also a mistake and a tragedy when somebody tells you what you will experience, but rather how you might experience your own body and mind. What are the kinds of experiences? So one thing that happens quite often if we are meditating for any period of time, whether again it's walking meditation or sitting meditation or other ways, one thing that you start to see is you start to see the activity of your thoughts. You start to see a flow of thoughts coming, usually one after the other, just a jumble. Initially, it appears maybe just like a jumble or just like a onslaught, a torrent, a stream, a steady stream of all kinds of quote unquote random things, right? But they're not actually random. There are specific causes and conditions that we can identify about our thoughts. But before getting to that, I just want to say, so what you see is you see a stream of thought, and you might, after some period of time, begin to notice certain patterns, certain tendencies that you have. I spoke a little bit in the question and answer last week about the underlying tendencies, the anusayas. But I don't want to talk about that in a technical sense. I want to just talk about just regular old habit patterns, which are expressions actually of those other more technical terms, but tendencies that you see in the mind. So you often, maybe you experience yourself as a person who often goes to fear and anxiety, or you experience yourself as a person who often goes to sadness, or often turns to anger or confusion, right? We see various habits of mind. We might see some storyline that we tell again and again and again. You know, I'm the victim, or I'm the hero, or I'm the helper, or I'm the good person, or I'm the bad person, or any number of different ways of thinking about patterns that you can observe. And these kinds of patterns of thought are very important for us to learn about, right? Because it's a way of studying the as a way of studying very clearly whether we are responding to the moment or we are responding to some habitual story. So patterns in and of themselves are not problematic. Tendencies of the mind are in and of themselves not particularly problematic. In fact, one of the interesting things that you see in folks who are highly realized, and you see stories about them from the past, is that they also had tendencies. There were ones that were more strict and ones that were less strict. There were ones that were more Sariputta, for example, was known for expressing a lot of gratitude. That was his thing. He liked to express his gratitude a lot. Ayakema, the German nun who was one of the first women to pick up the Theravada ordination, again after the lineage had died out for some time. She was known for being very quick to respond. So people have different types of tendencies, and that's not a problem as long as it's responding to the conditions of the moment. As long as it's responding skillfully and in a wholesome way to the conditions of the moment. So I'll give you an example of this. So, and because our tendencies also come from the learning process, right? The memory process, and us having had life experiences. Through your life experiences, you are going to learn about different ways of thinking about the world. That's natural, that's useful, that's absolutely necessary. But I'll tell you a little bit of a story. So when I was a young woman, my grandmother, Mami Olga, and my aunt, Nora, were going to teach me how to make arepas. And what are arepas? Arepas are these very delicious fried corn cakes. They come in like a little patty, like a little flat, like a patty, like a hamburger patty, or but they're made out of cornmeal, and a little salt, sometimes maybe a little cheese. And in Colombian style, where my family is from, Colombia, South America, they're usually made fried. So you learn how to make this patty out of moist cornmeal, and then you dunk it into this very hot oil, right? And so you have to learn. So at the beginning, when I was learning how to do this, I was very afraid, right? Because here's this hot oil, and you're dropping this thing into hot oil, and it would splash and burn you. And then I got burned a couple of times. And so that was natural, right? I know that the hot oil is dangerous, it's harmful. And so I'm concerned about it. But what I learned from my aunt and my grandma, my grandmother, was that in order to do the things so that you wouldn't get burned, you had to get very close to the oil. You had to actually learn how to insert the arepa into the oil, and you had to get pretty close in order to prevent that splashing back from happening. So you kind of just slide it on in there, and then it goes down, and then it makes this beautiful little puffy pastry thing, which is delicious. So that was learning how to respond to the moment, right? To get closer, actually, to burning hot instead of staying further away. So that was learning that skillfulness, right, of response, and working with that tendency of the fear in such a way that I could learn something new also about it. So it's not that the fear in that case was wrong. It's that, right? It's that I am learning how to work with it, how to be skillful, how to know that it's there, and how to know how to work with the conditions of the physical world. So that's just a sort of simple example. Yeah, so that learning how to see, observe the tendencies of the mind is what the Buddha spoke about when he said that he, after some period of time in his practice, after some very intense practice, he realized, oh, there were some kinds of thoughts that were wholesome and some kinds of thoughts that are unwholesome. And he was able to start to distinguish between those, right? And not pursue and not put energy into the ones that were unwholesome. So those unwholesome responses, or those unwholesome thoughts that are not actually responding to the moment well. Yeah. So then that's one type of experience you might have. Then another kind of experience that you might have as you continue to meditate, as you continue to observe what's happening, pay attention, is you might begin to observe the process nature of the mind. So you begin to see that individual thoughts are not just random, that they're actually related to bodily sensations, related to other thoughts. Different sequences become clear, not just the patterns of them, but actually the way that individual thoughts and sensations arise is part of a process. So, as I said, I'm at my daughter's place this week, so I don't have all my props. But this is the point usually where I would bring out the little contact balls, right? So what you see is that there is a moment of contact, something happens. So as an example, years ago, I would be sitting in retreat and my knee would start to hurt. So what happens? There is a contact, there is a bodily sensation, right, of pain, and that becomes known by the consciousness that is aware of the form body. Right? So there's a moment of body consciousness, a moment of consciousness of that particular touch, sensation of touch. And so, and it's unpleasant, and there's this unpleasantness to it, and because there's this unpleasantness to it, then I perceive it, and perceiving means like labeling it, and I label it, oh, pain, there's pain in the knee, my knee hurts, right? And then comes the good part, right? Then comes all the juicy stuff, which is the story about the pain in the knee. Oh, and then I'm going to hurt myself and I'll have to go to the doctor. And if I go to the doctor, then what? Then, maybe I'll have to have surgery on the knee, and then I won't be able to meditate anymore. And who will I be if I can't meditate anymore? And so on and so on and so on and so on, right? You see that each thought, sometimes you can see that the thought becomes the object of the next thought. Right? So you have that first physical sensation, though, and after a while, you notice, oh, there is a process to it. The physical sensation is known by one of the sense organs, by the consciousness, and that is perceived in some way, and then usually there's a reaction or a response to that perception. Right? This is the framework that the Buddha gave us of the 5 aggregates, they're called, right? And why is that important? To notice that when you can start to observe that in your experience, this is a very important moment, because then you can actually distinguish those two things. You can start to see the difference between the tendencies, the patterns, the stories, the currents, if you will, of the content itself, and the process that's going on, the actual mechanics of what's going on, right? You can tell the difference between the content, the story, and the mechanics, how that story is actually generated in the mind. And when you can do that, then suddenly you have new choices, because you can change the content of your life. As I've said many times, you can change the content of your life. You can change what you do for a living. You can move your place of residence. You can study something new. You can heal some of your past psychological wounds. You can change the content of your life, but you cannot change the process of how mental phenomena arises and ceases. If you want that to stop, then that will be suffering. And it sounds silly, but that's what happens, right? Sometimes we think, oh, I want my mind to be able to stay permanently on one thing, or to never react to a particular condition, or to be oblivious to pain, or I want my body to always just be, not a problem for me, not conducing to any kind of thought or perception of pain. But if you really think about it, of course, when you state it that boldly, right? It's like, well, of course, that's not possible. That's not how the process works. So learning the difference between the process that's happening and the content that is arising within that process is very important for making choices that will help conduce to less suffering and less resistance in your life, right? Less resistance to what's real in your life. So again, the Buddha's example around this is a framework like the 5 aggregates. There are many other different frameworks, but you could say the 5 aggregates, or his teachings also about the 6 sense bases, right? So that's why we did 3 of the 6 sense bases this morning, was to have a look at exactly that, right? Can you begin to train the mind to be able to observe clearly the process nature of what comes in from one of the sense gates? And then lastly, we have, or lastly for today's talk anyway, maybe there is more that wants to be explored here, but the third sort of general way, the third how you might experience your meditation, is that you might begin to have enough concentration and enough clarity, enough stability in the mind to be able to see specific conditionality. Specific conditionality. So one of the ways that we see this is when you see the poetry, or you hear the descriptions of people who have awakened, they often talk about what was the condition that happened right before the awakening. And why is that? Because they're pointing to that mindfulness that was present at that moment, and the specific condition. And what's interesting about it is it's not always the same. right? It's not always the same, except that we know that the final condition is the same, which is the letting go, the release. Mm. But for this, I want to say a little bit about Patachara. Patachara is one of the awakened women of the Buddha's time. She was someone who experienced a lot of loss and death in her life. She lost all her family members in one couple of days, actually. Her children, her husband, her parents, her brother. And she was very, very strongly impacted by that. She was overwhelmed with that grief. But through her practice and through her contact with the Buddha and the members of the Sangha, she was able actually to work through that overwhelm and that grief, and to find such incredible clarity and stability that she became one of the arhats of the Buddha's time. And she was declared one of the foremost bhikkhunis, actually. One of the foremost. And so she tells this story. So, I often say that the monastics, we usually get together on the full moon days and sometimes on the new moon days to talk about how our practice of the precepts is going in both Zen tradition and Theravada tradition, although it's done very differently in the two. But we get together, and they would have used the moon days specifically because that was a way when people knew that they needed to travel, right? This is how they could tell time. So it's like, okay, I'm supposed to meet up with my sisters on the full moon, and I know that I'm a 2-day walk away from where the meeting point is. So I look up at the sky each night, and I can tell how many days away from full it is and when I need to start walking. Yeah. And so they would meet outdoors underneath the full moon. They would gather together and they would tell each other these verses of awakening and these stories about what had happened on the path and what had happened in different towns when they met up with the Buddha or with different other Sangha members, or how it went, teaching, or any of those things, how their practice is going. And so Patachara gave this poem for us. So I'll read the poem, but I think we're going to focus mostly on the end of it. So she says, plowing the field with plows. She's talking about farmers at the beginning here. Plowing the field with plows, sowing seeds or planting seeds in the ground, nourishing their wives and their children or their families. Young men find wealth. So now this is a metaphor, right? This is a metaphor that she's talking about. So, and she's also in a way, and I'm not going to go into the whole social commentary that's happening here, but she's also in a way making a social commentary, right? Because the women, the bhikkhunis and the nuns in general, folks who had stepped out of that whole scenario, as the Buddha had also, right? The men had also stepped out of that whole way of being in order to take up the monastic life. She says, why do I, who am possessed of virtuous conduct, right, who am following the ethical precepts and complying with the teaching of the teacher, so I'm following the practice guidelines, I'm trying my best to implement the teachings that I've received, not obtain nibbana. Not obtain nibbana. So she's making this metaphor, right? She's making this comparison, this simile, like planting seeds. That's the virtuous conduct, the ethical, living the ethical life is planting the seeds for the awakening, for the nibbana. complying with the teaching or following the teachings that are offered, engaging in the practice. That is planting the seeds. Yeah. So why hasn't it happened yet? Right? She's expressing some impatience here, or some frustration, or some maybe even doubt at that, earlier stage. This is what she was thinking beforehand. She says, I'm not a slacker. I'm not slack, and I'm not puffed up. So I'm not a slacker, and I'm not arrogant or sort of overestimating my practice. Yeah. So she's like, well, I'm doing all the right stuff. and then what? And then she tells this next two verses where she tells, okay, what happened? What happened? So she says, I washed my feet and I paid attention to the water. So I'm making some modifications to a translation that was done by Norman, K.R. Norman is his name. K.R. is his initials and Norman is his last name. He's a long ago translator. He's not a contemporary translator. This is an older version, but he actually did a very nice job on Patachara's, Venerable Mahateri Patachara's poem. So she says, I washed my feet and I paid attention to the water, and seeing the water come flowing downhill from the higher to the lower. So what is this about? This is just a detail of the moment, right? If you washing your feet isn't necessary in order to wake up. Let me say that much. It just so happens to be the thing, right? This particular set of conditions that helped her to focus her mind, or that on which she had focused her mind in that moment. And there's something about the water flowing from the high to the low that means something to her, right? That there's we're not sure, it's not possible to tell exactly what was happening, but there's some indicator there, right? And her mind was very focused and she can remember in great detail what's happening there. And then she says something very interesting. And I very much like Norman's connection here, the way that he's translating this here. He says, she said, Venerable Mahateri Patachara said, I collected my mind as like a noble thoroughbred horse, or a noble well-bred horse. I gathered up the mind, I collected the mind. So what is that she's talking about? She's talking about samadhi, right? She's talking about that ekagata, when the mind becomes very, very contained and focused and clear. I collected my mind. All right, so there she is. So she's done, the preparatory steps have been done. She's observing very, very clearly what is the state of her mind, right? And she's telling us about the content, and the content is particularly mundane, right? Washing your feet, right? This kind of thing. Then, staying on the mundane, I took a lamp and I went into my hut. I entered my hut and I looked at the bed and sat down. He says, sat down on the couch. I'm not really sure. Unlikely that she had a couch in her hut, but there's like some sitting place. She didn't sit down on the bed. She sat down on wherever the sitting place was in her hut. Okay, still, right? Very mundane, very simple content, but very specific. Okay, so then I did this and then I did that, right? Completely mindful, very aware. And then she says, I took a needle and I drew out the wick of the lamp. That's how you put it out. You pull out the, this is an old like oil lamp, right? You have a little lamp, a little like a little tiny bowl with some oil in it, and it just has a little bit of a wick, and you take a needle or some kind of a sharp object, and you just pluck the wick out of the oil. That's how the candle, the flame goes out. Okay. So she says, I took a needle and I drew out the wick. And the complete release of my mind was just like the quenching or the going out of the lamp. Release. Complete release. Right in the midst of an utterly mundane moment of life. So now, why is she telling us this? Again, she's telling us this in part to convey what was the mind like? What were the things that she observed at that time? Yeah. And the specific conditionality that happened, right? So when the Buddha speaks about, for example, the night of his awakening, and he talks about the chain, the 12-fold chain of conditioned arising or interdependent arising, that's what he's saying. This condition leads to this condition, and that condition leads to that condition. And when this condition is gone, then that condition is gone, right? He says very clearly, when this is present, that is present. And when this is absent, then that is absent. And he went over and over again, he says, in his mind as he was awakening. Yeah. So this is the same kind of teaching. When you are meditating, you can start to see specific conditionality. And I'm going to try to wrap it up here soon because my time is up, but I want to just give you a simile or a metaphor for this. So there was a time when I was out in the monastery there in California, and I was sitting outdoors, which I love to do, and I was on a silent retreat, silent personal solo retreat, and I was just sitting out there on the deck having my tea with the gophers, and there was this big oak tree that was in front of me, just off the edge of the deck, just a couple of yards away. But it was a cloudy day. It was a very cloudy day. It was a winter. It's like late January, early February, and very overcast. But then what happened was that the clouds parted for a moment, and the sun came out. And so suddenly it was a very bright sunny day for just a moment. And then what happened? Then I noticed, there's a shadow. The tree casts a shadow. And then again, the clouds closed up and it became very overcast again. And then no shadow. And it was just a very small moment of, yes, it's like that. It's like that. To see that when this condition is present, there is that, is like seeing that when there's a bright sunny day, there was a shadow of a tree. And when that condition is absent, then no shadow. And in the same way, when you have the condition of clinging, there is a sense of self. And when there is complete release, then nibbana, non-self, non-greed, non-hatred, non-delusion is experienced. So why meditate? Well, because it's interesting, huh? Because it's interesting, and because it will show you how this very mind is demonstrating to a T in every single moment of your existence those very truths, those very teachings, that very possibility of release. So I wish you some very mundane moments of a collected, bright, clear mind that will let go. Thanks everyone for your attention.